This was supposed to be a simple project, but in actuality, it ended up being my most challenging build to date. I learned a lot along the way, so sit back, relax, and let my mistakes be your successes. At least one of us will enjoy this. Maybe both. We'll see. I like to start every project with positivity and excitement. At least that's the mindset I feel I have to go into each new build with for it to be successful. On this build in particular, I completely underestimated how difficult it was going to be. And I probably should have known that going into it, considering the project I'm building today is a chair. And more specifically, a pair of chairs. Because if something's challenging once, doubling your effort should make it easier, right? Alright, maybe that's not always the case, but I decided to go with plywood for this project to simplify the build process. So the first step was to trim out my sheets into more manageable sizes. But before we get into all the details of how I built this piece, let's hop in and take a peek at what the chairs should look like. For the design, I went with a mid-century modern lounger meets kitchen chair. That's both intentional and practical because these are going to replace two of my current dining chairs. The chair features two armrests designed to hug the sitter and an angled backrest that complements those sides. I wanted to keep things pretty round with the design, even though it's emerging from a flat sheet to play off those two contrasts. So now that we know what the goals are for this piece, let's get into making these chairs come to life. Now, as you probably noticed from the animation, I need my parts to be pretty beefy for this design. So my plan here is to laminate my parts to get to my final thickness of 36mm, which does indeed sound a whole lot better than 1 7/16 of an inch. No argument here. The first step in that process is to apply a thin but even layer of glue to the top of my substrate. From there, I'll use a few pieces of blue tape to align my panels, then slide them into the vacuum press. I've used my vacuum press quite a few times on the channel, and I get a lot of questions as to whether it's necessary for specific glue ups. And when it comes to making laminated panels, I don't think there's a better way to do so. There are many options on Amazon for vacuum bags that can be used with a shop vac that'll give you plenty of clamping pressure to laminate boards. So don't think you have to go all in with an expensive vacuum press to approach projects like this one. What I am aiming for here is a perfect vacuum, and I'm going to leave my parts in the vacuum press for about an hour. This way there's plenty of time for the glue to set up. Once my panels come out of the vacuum press, I'll set them aside so they have even airflow on both sides and let them finish curing overnight. This will give me laminations that are just as high quality as the original layers in the Baltic birch. And I think that's kind of important to point out, because people see Baltic birch and they immediately just see dollar signs. But high quality plywoods like Baltic birch or marine grade ply are more expensive because they're void of voids and they're incredibly dense, which makes them great for adding structure to projects where it's needed, like chairs. So while the glue cured, I used my CNC to cut out a few templates for my chair parts. At this point, all these parts are slightly larger at the joints than they need to be. This way I have plenty of room to cut my joinery after my work pieces are trimmed out. And it's also at this point that I should mention that if you guys want plans for this project, just let me know down in the comments, and if there's enough interest, I'll put them together. Once I had my templates in hand, I could move on to laying out my parts on my panels. This is another area where plywood makes this process a bit easier, because for the most part, the grain is relatively even. So unlike using hardwood where you need to hunt for the best grain, plywood is a what you see is what you get kind of deal. Next, I can head over to the bandsaw to rough cut my work pieces, being sure to cut about 1/8 of an inch outside my line. And this part's deceptively tricky because these dense panels are super heavy. I'm just making it look easy with my dad strength. But since we're here, it's time for another bandsaw thought. It's weird that my childhood punishments are now my adulthood goals. Going to bed early, not leaving the house, and not going to the party. You know, standard stuff. With all my parts rough cut, I can next head over to my drill press to remove the bulk of the material from the center of my armrests. If you own a scroll saw, that would be a better and quicker option for this type of procedure, but I don't, so a Forstner bit will have to do. All I'm going to do here is plunge my bit straight through my workpiece and hog out as much material as I can without hitting my outline. Other than that, I'm just making sure that the tip of my bit is always in contact with some part of the workpiece. Otherwise, the bit will wobble out of place and possibly take a chunk out of my parts. Yep, I've learned that one the hard way. With all my parts slimmed down as they can be, it's time to head over to the router table to give them that final Jenny Craig treatment, which is just a fancy way of saying I'm going to trim them down to their final shape. So I'll first attach my templates to my work pieces using some very sticky double-sided tape. Then from there, I can cut them out. And to do that, I'm going to be using a flush trim up-down bit. What this bit does is create a down cut for the top face and an up cut for the bottom face. This is great for plywood because it eliminates almost all chip out that might occur since there's no blades cutting away from the faces lifting the grain. They're a little pricey, but if you're planning on building a lot of plywood projects, they're a solid investment. I'll leave a link to the one I'm using here in the description for anyone who's interested. When it comes to hogging out the material in the center, I just take my time and work my way around the template, making sure to always keep the bit pulling itself into the workpiece by going left to right. That reminds me, did you hear the one about the guy whose left side was cut off? Yeah, he's alright now. And hey, if you're enjoying these woodworking tips and highbrow dad jokes, make sure you subscribe. It really helps the video out, and I greatly appreciate your support. So back over at the table saw, I could go ahead and cut in the bevels for the armrest into the sides of the seat. I decided to start with the sides because doing so allows me to have a square reference edge to work off of for the remaining parts. There are quite a few tricky compound miters within this design, so referential measuring is pretty pivotal for success, and I'll explain more about that throughout the next couple steps. Once I had my 70-degree bevel cut into my seat bottom, I could cut the complementary angle into the bottom of the armrest. This again is why I left all my joints long on the templates. Because if I flush trim down to my final width, I'm not going to have enough material left to cut my joinery in. And more than likely, I'd probably remove too much material and all my joints would be under by a 1/16 of an inch or something like that. When it comes to joinery, it's always a good idea to err on the side of too thick or too large than the other way around. And that's because it's easy to remove material, but it's a hell of a lot more difficult to add it back. It was at this point that I started to notice that things weren't quite right with my chair. And at some point, I had made things a little too long, and you'll see me start to realize that here. Something's not right. I think it's too long. Well, Shop Shane, you were indeed correct in that the chair is, or was rather, 3 inches too long. So I had to hit the reset button and come up with a solution. Some of the parts, like the seat, were pretty straightforward in that I just had to take 3 inches off the back side. This was made a little easier because I had already left my parts about a 1/4 inch long anyway. Again, easier to remove material than add it back. Love it when a tip comes full circle. The next step was a little trickier in that I had to move the back of my armrest template forward by 3 inches. And to do that, I just used my 1-2-3 block again. Now, the trickiest adjustment of them all was with the legs. And that's because I had already cut out the legs, so making the adjustments meant I had to work within my existing workpieces. So I hopped back into the sketch and pulled the front and rear points of the leg assemblies into the middle by about an inch. This kept the middle section of my legs unaltered while thinning out the depth. Once I had re-roughed all my parts, it was back over to the router table to re-Jenny Craig the workpieces. And this time, I'll keep it off. The only big change I made with this process was instead of using the templates for every part, I used my templates to adjust one workpiece and then use that altered piece as the guide. This way, any changes to the alignment were easy to correct. Since a lot of my parts are stuck together like Matt Damon and Greg Kinnear, I felt like it was a good idea to go ahead and sand the edges. This gives me a lot more surface area to keep things flat and reduces the amount the edges will get rounded over in the process. From there, it was time to embark on probably the most difficult portion of this build, and that is the backrest. The first step was to go ahead and cut the bevels into the back of the seats, and since these are also angled bevels, they're technically compound miters. But I wanted to make sure that I designed the backrest so that it was comfortable to the sitter. Seated, you know what I mean. So I decided to angle the back both 20 degrees and at 86.5 degrees. This in itself created some challenges because I had to create a wedge that was 3.5 degrees to cut the opposing angles. And this is because the table saw blade only tilts one way. If I try to flip the sled and cut it on the other side of the blade, the seat ends up running into the blade and alignment becomes kind of messy. It's just like when I found stir fry all over the bed this morning. Must have been sleepwalking again. So with the bevels cut into the seat, it was on to mirroring those angles on the backrest. And in theory, that doesn't sound overly complicated. However, when you're thinking about an angle that's starting more open and ends more narrow like the center of the backrest does, there's a lot of math that goes into it. So the first step was to go ahead and make a sled with the same 20-degree angle as the rear of my seat and cut that bevel into my workpieces. Now because I have two sides to my backrest, I'm going to have to make two separate sleds for each cut. So to make that easier, I just use some CA glue to tack my reference blocks in place, and then I can knock them off and reuse the sled. With the lower bevels cut, it was on to the center miters. Believe me when I tell you that I overthought about these miters for 2 days ahead of these cuts. And that's really because if these miters are too narrow, the backrest isn't going to align with the sides of the seat. And if they're too wide, I'll have to chase down the correct length and things become more stressful. So it was really important for me to nail my cuts for each part. That's one of the reasons I like to overmark my boards from time to time, especially when I want to visualize what material will be removed. This helps me to set up my sleds and gives me a tangible view of my final workpiece. Once I had my right side trimmed down, I used that workpiece as a reference board to mark out the final dimensions on the left side. I like using a marking knife in this situation because it shows me precisely where my cuts need to go. From there I can reinforce that line with a pencil, set up my sled, and make the cuts. All that was left now was to go ahead and test the fit. And believe me when I tell you that there was a massive sigh of relief when everything came together and aligned correctly. So the next step to tackle was the joinery. And for the joinery on this chair, I'm going to be using floating tenons or dominoes as they're more commonly named. That said, you could absolutely use dowels for a project like this. You would just need to create some jigs for the proper angles. The first thing I'm going to start with is the backrest. And that's because the rest of my parts come together based on where the backrest lives. And I can't attach the sides until the backrest is aligned. And I'll show you why that is in just a moment. Plunging the mortises is pretty straightforward in that all I have to do is set my fence to match my bevel angle and then set the height to half the thickness of my material, which in this case is going to be 18 millimeters. I know, I say it all the time. I'm decilingual. What do you want me to do? And to that point, whenever I'm building plywood furniture, I always work in metric. I just find it a lot easier to keep track of things that way. That being said, I do prefer working with hardwood more than plywood overall because I feel like it's more forgiving. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the subject, so let me know down in the comments if you prefer plywood or hardwood. I know that situationally those things are going to change, but humor me. If you prefer working with plywood, start your comment with plywood. If you prefer working with hardwood, start your comment with hardwood. And as always, if you start your comment with hardwood or plywood, I'll reply to you first because I know you're paying attention. Next up on the Gantt chart was to lay out all the joinery for the sides, backrest, and seat. This is one of those things that takes a ton of time, but saves a lot of headaches if done right. This layout process probably took me 2 hours or so, but it's worth it in my book to avoid costly mistakes. And once I have all the joinery laid out, plunging the mortises goes pretty quickly. This is one of those examples of referential measuring I was talking about earlier on. Because once I lay out the joinery on one part, I again just use that as a reference for the remaining parts. I have a loose idea of where the joinery should go, but for the most part, I'm looking for practical solutions. So if in the shop I feel I need to add an additional tenon to give the piece the strength it needs, I just do it. To me, peace of mind and practicality are more important than the plan I drew up on the computer. So with the joinery cut on the seat, backrest, and sides, I could clamp the backrest to the seat and use my block plane to cut the proper angle for the edge of the backrest. Again here, I'll rely on referential measuring to give me that angle. This is one of those parts that was kind of a head scratcher for me. I wasn't sure what the final angle was going to be for this part, so I used the bevel on the seat as the guide. Once I had the side fully seated and fitting correctly, I could then measure and transfer that angle onto the other parts for the backrest. The cool thing about this situation was that I could go back to setting my sled up once I had that angle. Then I could trim off a sliver from each remaining backrest at the table saw. This saves me from having errors in sculpting the other angles by hand and the work it takes to do so. Smarter, not harder. From there, it was on to laying out the joinery for the legs. And again here, shocker, I'm going to use referential measuring. I want the back of the legs to align with the back edge of the backrest, so I just align those two edges, then lay out the joinery from there. Then again, not to beat a dead horse, I'll transfer all those markings to my other parts and plunge the mortises. One feature I altered in the shop was that initially I designed these legs with a slight splay, but I struggled with how the curved portions at the bottom would make contact with the ground. If I splayed the legs at 5 degrees like I originally drew up, then the rounded bottoms would need a flat surface cut at 5 degrees to sit correctly on the ground. And I wasn't a big fan of that look, so I made what I feel was a correct decision in removing that feature. One other pretty important part of the design was the fact that the rear tenon for the backrest goes directly into the leg vertically. I was concerned about how the backrest would attach to the seat and if it would have enough strength to be a backrest. But with the additional longer tenon adding vertical strength to the horizontal joint, I felt confident about the structure. With the legs in place, it was time to cut down the stretcher and apron parts. To get the measurements for my internal parts, I just like to use a couple of offcuts and some blue tape to find the dimensions. From there, I can bring the story stick over to my table saw and set up my stop. This is a quick and easy way to find those internal measurements without actually measuring. Some people may call it multitasking, but I call it doing something else until I remember what I was doing in the first place. Lengthy, but honest. The final major hurdle to conquer was locating the rear stretcher in space. What I mean by that is usually when building projects, you have a flat surface or edge to reference off of for your measurements. But because these are rounded parts, there's no angle that's a good reference point to work off of. So instead, I decided to use the top of my workbench as the reference surface. By standing the legs up vertically, I could clamp them together and transfer my markings from the edge, then wrap them around to the face of the legs. That's why I think it's always important to have a good flat reference surface to work off of when you're building furniture. And I think that's probably especially true when you're building chairs or tables or really anything that has four legs. With this design, there's not really an easy way to correct a teetering leg after the fact. Because if you have a wobbly leg on other pieces, you could just scribe a line on that leg and cut it down to even up those parts. Again, with the rounded feet in this design, that's not really an option. And I think that's probably why I was a little stressed out throughout this entire build. Because I knew that if everything didn't end up just right, I was going to be left with a chair that either A, wouldn't sit flat, or B, wouldn't support the person using it. And that's something I've struggled with when designing chairs in general. I'm always concerned about whether it's going to be sturdy enough or whether or not it's going to be comfortable enough. There are just so many different factors that go into the process. But what I will say is that as I build more chairs, I'm getting more comfortable with those questions, and that's making the process a lot more approachable. With the joinery out of the way, it was onto the edge treatments. And in sticking with the theme of rounded parts, I'm going to put roundovers on all my exposed edges. If you spend enough time in the shop, eventually you'll end up rounding over or putting an edge treatment on a part you didn't intend to. So to try to avoid that, I like to use a red pencil and mark all the areas in which I don't want an edge treatment. Then when I'm over at the router table, I can look at my edges before I place my workpiece face down and know where I should and shouldn't route. Yep, as sad as it is to say, I've learned so much from my mistakes that I'm thinking of making a few more. For any parts that are just too close to the edge to route, I finish breaking those edges with a sanding block. Usually those areas butt up against another part or joint, and in those cases, I'm not looking for the roundovers to 100% match everything. I actually think it's a little bit nicer when there's some fluctuation in those spaces to help break up the transition. I'm mostly just looking for those sharp edges to be removed. Then I can sand the remaining parts up to 180 grit, route in a quick relief in the bottom of my seat, and pop in my brand. Finally from there, it was on to the glue up, or glue ups I should say. But to make things simpler, I decided to break them down into smaller sections. The first of which is going to be the backrest and seat assembly. I also like to pre-glue all my dominoes in place. This way I'm not having to worry about fitting all my tenons while I'm clamping things up. Anytime I can simplify the glue up, I go for it. Those things are stressful enough as is. So all the glue ups are going to follow essentially the same theme, where I first glue in my dominoes and then glue and clamp the parts. I also like working this way because it allows me time to finish sand my next round of parts while I have my previous parts in clamps. This helps me be as efficient as I can in the shop, which is super important to me because I don't have a ton of extra time to spend in the shop. And with that being said, as many of you know, I work on these projects on nights and weekends, and having the support from you guys is what makes it all worthwhile. So I just want to say thank you for supporting the channel by watching, liking, and sharing these videos. And if you'd like to support the show further, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. There you'll get discount codes on plans and merchandise, access to the Discord chat where we can talk about what you're working on, or what I'm working on, or really anything woodworking, though we do go off on some other tangents. In any case, you just get access that you can't get through YouTube alone. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, check out the link down in the description. And as always, to those of you who've already joined, thank you guys so much for your continued support. Your donations go directly towards making these videos, so thank you. Alright, with the new finish cabinet open, the finish line's in sight. And for the finish on this piece, I'm going to be using Rubio Monocoat Pure, which again probably is not a shocker to the casual viewers of the channel. But for anybody who's not, first of all, welcome, and the reason I like using Rubio Monocoat is because it's incredibly durable and it's easy to repair if I need to do so in the future. There's also not a lot of sheen that comes through with this finish, so the matte look allows for the natural beauty of the lumber to shine through, and I'm a big fan of that. Not to mention, it's incredibly easy to apply, and if I'm being honest, finish work isn't my favorite work to do. So, with the finish finished, let's take a look at those glamour shots. Given all the struggles I went through while designing and building these chairs, I'm incredibly happy with how they turned out. This is one of those projects where every time I went forward 2 steps, I felt like I was taking one back. And honestly, those challenges just make the end result that much more rewarding. I love the sweeping curves throughout the design and feel that really contrasts nicely with the fact that these were once just a few flat sheets of plywood. To that point, I think the exposed plywood edges are awesome and give the chairs a ton of character. And proportionally, I'm thrilled with how they turned out, especially since I had to adjust the sizing midstream. In the end, I think they're a perfect fit. So if you enjoyed this journey and you'd like to go on another, check out this video over here next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and as always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.